in dealing with terrorists. First, make no concessions to terrorists and strike no deals. 2, bring terrorists to justice for their crimes. 3, isolate and apply pressure on states that sponsor terrorism to force them to change their behavior. And 4, bolster the counterterrorism capabilities of those countries that work with the U.S. and require assistance. You know how repressive a lot of these regimes are? Saudi Arabia, Egypt. You know how repressive these states are when the U.S. helps them become more repressive? People who are being repressed in these countries see the U.S. helping to bolster this kind of state repression. What do you think that does? Because the U.S. and other governments will not negotiate with militant groups or enemy states, the peacemaker is not supported and can be seen as a traitor or supporter of revolutionary ideology. As the U.S. Patriot Act defines any efforts to assist a terrorist group as itself a terrorist action in the media, Republican Party and Bush administration to this day continue to stigmatize critics of the invasion of Iraq or efforts to build a garrison state as traitors and collaborators. It was interesting. At UCLA, the end of about a year ago, the UCLA, right-wing group at UCLA created a list of 30 professors called the Dirty 30, the Trente Sucia. Put me at the top, and paid students, or offered to pay students. I don't know if any students actually got paid. Offered to pay students $100 to secretly audio tape my classes, or other classes of other professors on the left, $50 for lecture notes. I can give you their address, and you can just, if any of you are making notes now, I can tell you where to pick up a check for $100 if you wanted to send it to them. I'm kidding. But it's this kind of attempt to demonize people who oppose current policies of a wartime president. I mean, it hasn't, affected me personally in the sense of, people asking for my ouster at UCLA, but I'll tell you how it does affect people in a secondary way. I was invited to give a talk recently in Bogota, Colombia, and it was by a relatively progressive group associated with the mayor's office. And I came in, gave a talk for a week. People were wonderful, the reception was amazing, and with my very limited Spanish, with the help of some good translators, I got some really wonderful conversations with folks. When I returned, I got an email from the organizers and some professors who were there. And they said, "We want to thank you, Peter, for coming to Bogota, for coming to Colombia, and we know that you've been invited to Medellin and other places, but thank you for coming to us and spending a week of your time. We didn't want to tell you this when you were with us, but it took us months of negotiating to get you there, because people heard you were associated with the Dirty 30, and that you were, on a list, etc., by this right-wing list, and people were trying to use that to prevent you from coming to Colombia. But we fought and we won. We're glad. And we'd do it all over again if we could. But we can't do it all over again because we've all been fired. We've all lost our jobs. So while, the sad, pathetic irony of this is I'm sitting drinking a latte in the beautiful UCLA campus, having just returned from Bogota. And I go up to my computer and I read this message, and they're pounding the pavements in Bogota, trying to find work because they made a mistake of inviting me. So that's how these things can work. They might not affect you yet, but they can affect the lives of other people. These kinds of attacks and demonizations can really hurt. Now, it's interesting. I mentioned I was originally from Canada. And I wanted to give you this example. Because I'm Canadian, I thought this would be appropriate. I realized that this following example is rather absurd, but sometimes absurdities can capture elements of truth needed to put current historical events into perspective. What would happen if a Canadian scientist working in a basement laboratory at the University of Toronto, my old alma mater, happened upon a scientific discovery that allowed the Canadian military to develop a super weapon and become the world's most dominant military force? So I know it's absurd. But what if, moreover, this weapon was deployed successfully against the US military in a Canadian offensive designed to occupy the United States until it eliminated its scientific resources so that it would be rendered incapable of ever creating a like weapon? In other words, so that Canada could claim the status of the world's sole superpower, under the pretext of installing in the United States a universal health care plan. You know, the argument being that not having such a plan was the moral equivalent to murdering millions of innocent, uninsured civilians. Thank you. And, you know, and there's some truth in that. Well, if that were the case, would there be armed U.S. civilian resistance to such an occupation? Surely there would be. Right-wing reactionary groups, along with left-wing militant groups, communitarians and libertarians would fight hand in hand to drive out the occupiers, while some admittedly might welcome the occupiers as liberators. The Canadian government would lump, of course, all these ideological divergent resistance fighters into the insurgents, or terrorists, or Al-Qaeda. Would that mean that none of these groups would have any legitimate claims to attacking the occupying Canadian forces? We're merely trying to make the point that the occupiers have the official means to define who the terrorists are. Following our own hermeneutical counsel, we can try to understand the U.S. position that there is no resolution to the Al-Qaeda threat other than the military solution of total extermination of the radical Islamic enemy, which, of course, they never forget, is far more diverse and widespread than just one group. Given the unyielding resolves of jihadists to kill as many U.S. citizens as possible, to overthrow corrupt Arab governments, and to impose draconian Sharia law throughout the world. But rather than weaken or destroy groups such as Al-Qaeda through the military option, the failure of the U.S. to recognize the legitimacy of some jihadist complaints, such as those regard U.S. imperialism, and the causes of their violent campaigns, to dialogue with the Islamic community as a whole and to make necessary policy changes, the U.S. pursued a senseless invasion of Iraq and thereby whipped up anti-American hatred, exacerbated the terrorist threat to its citizens, destabilized the region, and alienated moderate Arabs so that they are more sympathetic now to the radicals. In a world racked by deep, persistent, and ominous conflicts, such as between Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, and the U.S. and North Korea and in Iran, it's critical that governments and authorities who want to progress towards peace understand the mission of a peacemaker and the need for a peacemaker. It's imperative that and it's not going to be Tony Blair. It's imperative that they undertake sincere and authentic diplomacy, not the type where functionaries such as U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, or, as I mentioned just now, proxy Ambassador Tony Blair, fly to a nation for tea, meaningless prattle, arrogant bullying, and tawdry photo opportunities. Emboldened, cajoled, and propped up by naive neocons and warhawks such as Cheney, Bush's fundamentalist Christian morality divides the world into good and to evil and morphs into this kind of Manichaean politics rooted in dogmatic refusals to deal with the enemy in any way except through silence or violence, in sharp contrast to more conciliatory approaches towards foes such as North Korea and Palestine as led by the Clinton and Carter administrations, for instance. I mean, the problems with that, of course.